Are you ready for an epic module? You're going to learn so much in this section. I've put so much in it to make you a really good programmer. So what are we building? Well, as you can see by the title, we're going to build a Back to the Future time travel app. So here's a little reminder of the film that's inspired this app. And it serves probably to whet your appetite because I don't know about you, but I absolutely love this movie.
He's sending Marty 30 years back in time.
It works! It's a flying saucer from outer space!
Now, he's trapped in the past,
It's gotta be a dream.
about to meet
Chocolate.
his future father.
He's a peeping Tom.
Wow!
And he's making an impression on his mother.
It's an absolute dream.
Well, there you have it. That's our inspiration. I actually kind of want to go watch the movie now. So in this section, we're going to make a very basic looking Back to the Future app, but there's going to be some important elements in here. We're going to learn all about tabbed apps, how we can display information in lots of different tabs. We're also going to learn some more advanced versions of positioning our elements inside of our view controllers and inside of the storyboard using the tools we have available. And that is going to be invaluable when you start creating your own apps. Then we're going to write a bit of code, like always, to get random years or get the current year, get the current date and time. That's something you'll do quite often in your programming career. And how to pick out letters from strings. Then we're going to set up timers. And timers repeat a block of code every X amount of time. So in our case, every second. And we're going to use that to show a ticking clock. So it's going to be pretty sweet. Then finally, we're going to take this time travel screen. When we hit that Start Time Travel button, we're actually going to show an animation for these 4-year numbers. And I'm not going to show you that in advance. You're going to have to complete the module to see what that looks like. But by doing that, I'm going to give you the tools to animate pretty much any property of any view that you're going to create in your apps. And that's going to be absolutely invaluable. Right, let's go. Let's understand a little more about tabbed apps in iOS. Now, chances are that you are going to be making a tabbed app eventually because it's just a very useful design paradigm so that you can display a lot of information at once without overwhelming the user. They're very native feeling now that iOS has been around for 11, 12 generations, whatever it is. And we've had a lot of apps that use tabs. So it's very useful for you to design your apps in the same manner. And of course, we have a whole bunch of examples. I mean, these are pretty old images, but you can see the classic Instagram tabbed apps. And we have various other items like Facebook and their tabs. So this is what we mean by tabs in iOS. Now, generally speaking, these tabs run along the bottom of your app. They tend not to run along the top. When it comes to Android, they do run along the top because the bottom has the on-screen home button, back button, and task switcher. Whereas in iOS, the only thing at the bottom, well, is nothing apart from the home button itself. So that's a distinction between the two operating systems that you should make. And if you read Apple's iOS design guidelines, they do say have your tabs at the bottom because my fingers can also reach that much easier and people expect it. So let's make our own version of a 2-tabbed app by opening up Xcode and creating a new project. Click Create a new Xcode project. You should be used to this by now. But before you click Next on this screen under iOS, we're not going to create a single view app. We're going to create a tabbed app, which is this option down here on the second row. It might look slightly different. Your Xcode may put it somewhere else. But that is the version that we want. Hit Next. And of course, we have to give this a name. So I'm going to call this Back to the Future, BTTF. Hit Next. And of course, save it wherever you need to save it. Right, so we have our basic app. We're presented with that initial screen, so we understand everything that's happening here. We've got a general tab, capabilities, resources, and you don't have to know what these are right now. We'll get to them as and when we need to. So everything's the same. If we come over to our list of files underneath the BTTF folder, and I'll just close these to make it clearer, we have the app delegate. We've seen that before. We have the first view controller and the second view controller, and these are the same apart from their names. So that's something different. Before we just had view controller. Okay. Now what else do we have? We have a main storyboard, and everything else looks the same. But in our storyboard, if we open it and zoom out, we have some new stuff here. We have a tab bar controller, and then first view and second view. Now, when we have a tabbed app, we need something that takes care of displaying the relevant tab, whichever tab we happen to have clicked on and is currently showing on the screen. And that's the job of the tab bar controller. So the controller is never something that you actually see on screen. It's just controlling which view we have, and it's keeping track of the items that are happening in those views. So by default, iOS knows, or rather Xcode knows, that we have two tabs. So that's the default project. We have the first tab, and of course we have the second tab. And if you go over to first view, you'll notice that that name first is the same as the name down here, and likewise with second view. So you know what they're pointing to. Now, if I zoom out and we look at these items, these little links with these lines, they tell us what the relationship is between the tab bar controller and which view it's going to. Now, if you ever wanted to create another tab, what you could do is drag your own line. So what I'm going to do, and you don't have to do this, but follow along if you want to, I'm going to click this first, or actually this second view, and I'm going to click the line that's going from the controller to the view, and just hit backspace, so it's gone. Now the tab controller realizes there's only one tab attached to it, and this second view is just floating. It's not called from anywhere, it won't be shown, or won't be even loaded. So how do we fix that? Well, let's control-click our tab bar controller and release it on second view. And then if we look at this list, we have manual segue show, show detail, present modally, popover. None of those sound like tab. We have a relationship segue, view controllers. What happens if we click that? There we have it. So our second tab becomes the new tab. So let's just practice that for a minute, because this is important to know. You're going to be making a lot of these apps. Let's drag in another view controller. So over in our object inspector, we should have view controller available. And if you can't see it, just type view and it should come up in the shortlist. Click and drag it and drop it in. So we have a view controller. Now this has nothing in it and it's never going to be shown unless we control-click and drag from the tab bar controller. And we click relationship segue to view controllers. And that is now tab number 3. So I'm just going to try and drag this so you can see the arrow. There we go. Now these arrows don't actually correspond to the icon on screen. They just correspond to the fact it's going into the controller. But this has been added as the third item. So I can scroll down here and there we have item. Now we don't need a third one for now. So let's remove that relationship and let's delete the view controller. So select it. You might have to select this middle space and then press delete, because sometimes, this is a bit buggy, it doesn't delete. So if it doesn't delete, zoom in, select it again, zoom in a bit more, select it again, and it won't go away. So what do we do here? Well, this is just another Xcode bug. So what I'm going to do is click and drag over it and then press delete, and now it's gone. So there's a few little idiosyncrasies, if you like, when it comes to Xcode and designing these layouts. So you should end up with your view like you can see here in my view. So we have view controllers and we have the tab bar controller, and it's relatively easy to add more tabs to it. Now, a word of note, you generally want to have at most 4 or 5, depending on the device you're targeting, tabs at the bottom. Don't try and ram in 20 tabs, because if you find yourself with 20 tabs, you haven't designed your app properly. You need to go back to the drawing board and hide away some of the items. So 4 or 5 tabs, absolute maximum. Okay, just 1 or 2 things more to cover in this little section. When we click our tab bar controller, you'll notice over in our inspector section on the top right, if you click the identity inspector icon and you look at the class, it's grayed out as UI tab bar controller. Whereas if you click the first view, we have first view controller, which corresponds to the first view controller over in our list of items. And of course, it's much the same with our second view controller. So that corresponds to the class that Xcode automatically created for us. So coming back to the tab bar controller, it's grayed out because there is no tab bar controller file in our project that we can see. There is a file that's going to get included with our compiled project, so the tab bar controller knows how to behave. But if you wanted to, you could actually create your own UI tab bar controller file, and you could assign it here underneath the class, and that would pick it up automatically once you've created it. Now, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the standard tab bar controller class that comes as a basic part of iOS, Xcode, and Swift. So we don't have to touch that. But that's just so you know, because later on, we're going to do stuff like that. Now, if you have a project and you only have a view, and you want to drop in a tab bar controller, well, as you might have guessed, over in the Object Inspector, we can search for tab, and there we have a tab bar controller. So we can scroll down somewhere empty, click and drag, and tab bar controller, if I release the mouse, will lay itself onto our desktop or onto our designer storyboard and drop 2 controllers by default. So I'm not going to do that, just going to keep it in there. So you can always do that, and you can control click and add the current view controllers that you have. Right, just one final thing, because I'm not sure I've told you this before, but in the storyboard, when we click this little arrow at the side here, what does that mean? That means it's the storyboard entry point. And in our list over on the left, that's what it tells us. That means whenever we load the storyboard, the tab bar controller gets loaded first by default. And there always has to be something that gets loaded first by default. Right, so we've created the basics of our Back to the Future app, and I've explained quite in detail about storyboards, tab bar controllers, and associated UI view controllers. So let's move on and start designing in the next section. Now we're going to move on with modifying our view controllers in the main storyboard and actually laying out the basics of our Back to the Future app. Now, because we are moving on and you've learnt a lot so far, I want you to put your own personal spin on this app. So you don't necessarily have to follow my color scheme. I want you to choose your own color schemes, to shuffle things around, change the shapes of them, do whatever you like, as long as it's vaguely similar to mine. And then once you've done that, drop us a screenshot and let's see what it looks like if you're really proud of your work. So let's open up Xcode and start creating your very own Back to the Future app. The very first thing that we want to do is change the names of these tabs. We don't want first and we don't want second because that doesn't make sense for us. So where do you do that? Well, you don't do it in the tab bar controller because first of all, there is nowhere to do it. And secondly, anything you do in the view controller tab at the bottom gets propagated backwards to the tab bar controller by default. So that's the sensible place to do it. If you select it, and then you select the attributes inspector at the top right, you can simply change the title of it. Now, what shall we call this? Well, the very first tab is simply going to display the time now. But the second tab is going to allow us to time travel, so we can change that attribute. And notice this gets propagated back to the tab bar controller. Right, now if you want to, you can change these images for any images that you please. And a great place that I like to go for images that are completely free, royalty free, you don't have to attribute anyone, is pixabay.com. It's also where I get all the fireworks from, if you were wondering. Right, so first we need some images related to time. So time now, and then time travel. Now scrolling through these images, there are only a few that sort of stand out as reasonable images that we can actually use for our tabs. Why do I say that? Because an image with a dark background isn't great. We're going to have to edit that. We want an image with a light background, perhaps like this clock. And what else are we going to use? Well, let's try this clock with the tree here. Okay, so we want a light background, and I'm going to show you why, because when you save all of these, let's call this time travel. And let's call this one time now. Okay, so we've got those two images. If we go back to our project and we go to our assets.xc assets, then we can add some images, new image set, and you've done this before, you should have, time now, and time travel. Okay, so if we get our time now and we drop in our time now into there, so let me just bring this over to my desktop. Oh, it's the spinning balloon wheel of death. Okay, so we have our time now. I can click and drag this into there. And we have our time travel, which we can also click and drag in. Right, so we've got our two items. Let's go back to our storyboard and let's try to assign these. So time now, if we select that view controller, and then we go over to the image, let's hit time now. And uh-oh, we have a big problem. And what I'm going to say right now is welcome to iOS. What happens if I have time travel? Well, that's also a problem because these images are too large. And as far as I know, there is actually no way to size them down. So this is your first little gotcha. How do you get around this? Well, if you open up Google, and I'd prefer to give you the tools on how to research these things rather than just give you the answers all the time because it'll make you a better developer. If we search for tab bar icon size, hopefully, well, we have a Stack Overflow post. We have the developer part of Apple. So let's try these two items. So here is our developer item. If your app includes tasks or modes that can't be represented by a system icon, or if system icons don't match your style, you can create your own. We know that. A custom icon, sometimes called a template, discards color information. So coming back here, that's why it's gone this weird blue, because it's just removed the color information. Completely gone. And uses a mask to produce the appearance you see on screen in any of these bars. Right, so that's an important note. All these items, they could be any color, but iOS puts a mask over them and makes them whatever color that it deems as good or that you program in. Right, so it's got a few design guidelines here. Create simple designs, use a solid color icon with transparency. So coming back to this, our time now, if you recall, had the transparency around the edges, whereas the time travel.jpg was white. And that's why the time now icon here has this round shape, because the outsides are clear. And conversely, time travel is square because the outsides are not clear. Okay, so that's Apple's versions of everything, and they tell you what you should do. And then down at the bottom, they have custom icon sizes. So recommended, navigation bar and toolbar icon size, tab bar icon size. So that's what we want. Now, it tells us we need 75 by 75 pixels for the 3x resolution and 50 by 50 for the 2x. I wouldn't worry about 1x. You're not going to be designing that anytime soon. So we actually need two types, 75s and 50s. And those, of course, are going to go into our assets.xc assets. So these images actually require a little bit of Photoshop manipulation. Now, that's not part of this course, and I don't want to make you guys sit through that. But if that's your thing, by all means, you can go do that. Alternatively, you can just Google iOS app icons tab bar, and there should be a few websites that provide these. We have Icon Beast Lite, Icons 8, I've used them before. So they're the ones that I know. In fact, let's use Icons 8. They're pretty good. Right, so we can just search for time. And over on the side, they don't have iOS 11 yet, but they do have iOS 10, so we'll keep that as it is. And there we have a nice time icon that we can have in 50 pixels or 100 pixels, whatever you need. So let's go for 100 pixels. We can download that. And it tells us, don't forget to include a link on each page you use our icons. Well, this is me giving them credit now. This is my telling you where I'm getting the icons from. So I'm going to close that. And besides, you're going to go retrieve your own icons from these places. Anyway, so we have our time. And we need one more for time travel. I think time filled is quite nice, so let's download that. Excellent. So that's icons8.com if you want to go get any icons. And don't forget to attribute. Tell people where you got it from if you use their icons. A link in your app or on your website is fine. Now, coming back to size, we need 75s and we need 50s. And seeing as you're on a Mac, this is very easy to do. We can use inbuilt tools to achieve that. All you have to do is double-click the image so it opens in preview. If it doesn't open in preview, just right-click it, click Open With, and select Preview from there or from Other if it's not showing. Right, so we have our preview. We have some tools, and we can adjust the size. So when that dialog pops up, we can go up to pixels, and we can make this a plain old 75 by 75. Make sure Scale Proportionally is clicked on if your image is square and you want it to remain that way. Then simply click OK. Then go to Tools. Let's go to File, and let's save that, or you can export it as a PNG. So you can call it something else. I'm going to pop this into my downloads. And this is the filled one, so we'll make this time travel. And we will give it the resolution 75 pixels. So we know which one it is in the future. Then we'll go to Tools. We'll adjust the size again. We'll go down to 50. And then we will export that. And if you just click this drop box down, we can actually get everything we need from it. So we can click the old name, and we can change that to 50 pixels. Okay, so these should appear in our latest files. And if I select this icon in my Finder, it will tell me some more details about the files. You just have to let it catch up with itself. Or if I select this one, that's a better one, it'll give us the details of the files, because we have to make sure they're 75 pixels and 50 pixels respectively. Oh, that's not working too good. Right, we'll just go to the Downloads folder. Okay, so we've got our 50. Let's click that little icon so we get our details. Time travel 50. That's 50, and that's 100. Whoops, so we got to change that. So let's go back, adjust our size, 75 by 75, export to the 75, we'll overwrite it, and now we should be all sorted, so we can close that image. And that is now 75. So it's a good idea to now test these two images. Let's go back to Xcode, go to time travel, and let's drop in the 75, but where do we drop it? 75 is 3x. There we go. And the 50 in the 2x. Now let's test that out. Let's go to the storyboard. Oh, brilliant. So that works excellently. We have our time icon, but we actually want that one to be in time travel. So let's change its image to time travel. And let's go back to the first tab and go to time now, which is still a horrible one. Go to assets, go to time now, and let's do the same process in preview for time now. So what do we want here? We want to get our latest files, date added. It is this one right here. Okay, so tools, adjust size. You should be getting the hang of this now. Okay. And it's quite neat because, I mean, preview has a lot of power that people just don't realize how much power it's actually got. So time now, 75. The things you can do in it. Like, I almost don't need Photoshop anymore. Almost. Let's have 50 by 50. File, export. Time now, 50. Okay, so we can close preview. We have our time now 50, which goes into there, and time now 75, which goes into 3x. Now, if we go to our storyboard, we have two very different looking icons. Time now and time travel. And notice how it has dropped the color information. They were only black and white, but it's overlaid its own blue color. Now to change that, it's a little more complicated and a bit more involved, and that's a lecture for a completely different day. We're not going to do that right now. But that's how we set up our tabs and get those custom images in there. Right, in the next section, we're going to carry on with creating the views of our time-traveling app. Here we go. We're going to now create the main view of the very first tab of our app, and that's the one that currently says First View and loaded by First View Controller on it, with our handy little tab bar icon at the bottom that says Time Now. So open up your project and let's get creating. Right, so the purpose of our first view, Time Now, is simply to show us the current time and the current year that we're in, because, hey, time travel is difficult. We can get lost. It would be handy to have a little clock going. So first of all, let's remove whatever xcode is put in there. Simply select it and hit backspace to delete it. So we start with a blank slate. And if you just click and drag inside there, nothing should get selected. If something does get selected, then remove that item. Right, so what are we going to show? Well, I'd like to show the year, perhaps in a box up here. And then below that, I want to show the current time and date. So the year really is the main feature of our app. We're time traveling through the years. It's what our users want to see. So it's your first introduction to thinking about user interface. You should make the thing that you want your customer or your user to interact with the main focus of the screen, so they don't have to think about where they're going to tap. They know, then they know what to look at as well. Now, later on in this module, we're going to do a few animations, some nice snazzy animations. And we're going to have kind of a flipping animation for our year display. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need 4 different labels, one for each digit of the year. So If you have 2006, then you'll have 2006 in different labels. So let's just drop in a label from our little object list here. Let's expand it manually a bit. There's no constraints on it yet. Let's double click it and just put a 2 in. Then let's expand that font size for the number 2. So I'm going over to the Attributes Inspector, and I'm just increasing this, maybe to 130. Let's see what that does. That's not too bad. I think it could be just a touch smaller, 120, to make sure we fit everything. Let's just click Done. Let's change this display to the smallest possible one, which is, of course, the iPhone 4. And it's unlikely at this day and age you will actually be targeting iPhone 4 devices. You're going to just target exclusively probably from iPhone 5 upwards. But iPhone 5 does have the same width as the iPhone 4 in terms of pixels. And a physical screen size, I think. Right, so I'm just shifting this up a bit until it looks good somewhere. Right, so we've got our 2. Now, I think with that 2, I would like to fix its width and its height. We don't really want that to change. Let's have width and height on our constraints. Let's add those 2. Great. So now you can actually copy this. Just select it and hit Command-C, Command-V. And let's move the next one right up next to it. So there we have it. Now there's 4 digits. So we want to define the center line of our digits as being the center line of our view controller down the center here. So at the moment, these might be a bit too big, but we can always go right to the edges. And I'm going to constrain this second number to the center. So I'm going to Control, click and drag on it and just drop somewhere in the view. And then let's look through our options. We can center it horizontally. I think that's a good idea, so we'll do that. That's going to drop it into the center. But now we can do a bit of maths. We can look at its width. So what width have we given it? Well, it's 68. Half of that is 34. So if we go back to our center constraint, and we double click that, and we hit minus 34, that's going to shift it right over to one side. And that means that the right-hand edge of this number 2 sits directly on the center line. So that's perfect. That fits nicely. Now let's just shift this one right up to this 2 so that the left-hand side and the right-hand side are on the same line. So let's hit Control, click and drag. Let's have horizontal spacing. Let's select that horizontal spacing, double click it, and just put 0 in. And that's going to butt them up right next to each other. Okay, perfect. Now let's paste in another number, Command-V. It should still be in memory. We can shift this up here. Control, click and drag to this middle 2. Horizontal spacing. Whoops. See what I mean? When you click it, it moves down sometimes. And you double click it, put 0 in. We have our next number. And let's paste another number. Control, click and drag, the usual deal. Horizontal. And if you can't see that horizontal constraint, like here, we can't see it too easily, just move your number away a bit. And it should make itself known somewhere. Famous last words. Of course, it's not doing that now that I've talked to you about it. I think it may be this thin blue line going vertically up where the cursor is. Well, actually, let's move it a bit further away. Right, so we've got a problem here. We can't see this horizontal constraint. And if you can't see it, or you can't click it, then you can select your item. And over in this little list of items, you can click the arrow, and your constraints will be shown. So we have a width and a height. So I think that it's not actually showing our constraint. So if that doesn't work, which clearly it doesn't, you can come down to the list of constraints in the view, and you can go that way instead. So we have this two, we have between those two, aha, and it's this one. Now, when you select that constraint, over on the right-hand side, under the Attributes Inspector, you can see what the constant is. And for some reason, it's -1. Well, we want that to be 0. So that's all going to slot in there. But you'll notice we've still got red lines. And that's because these items don't actually know where they sit, vertically speaking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this second 2, because that's our main constraint 2, if you like. Control click and drag to the view. And I'm going to set this as center vertically in the container. But then I'm just going to offset that upwards a bit. So perhaps by 100, or even -100. Let's drop that a bit, -80. Perfect. So that's constrained. The rest of these 2s are not actually constrained yet, but we can fix that pretty easily. Control click and drag over to this 2. Let's align the tops. Same with this 2, align the top. And finally, the last one, top. Now this last one is showing orange, that's fine. If we want to have our display update itself, i.e. move from where it currently is to the orange location, sometimes Xcode doesn't do that automatically. So if you look down at the bottom corner of this display, there's a little icon that says Update Frames. And if I click that, it will move everything in place. If I simply click the View controller, Update Frames isn't available, but if I just shift something out of the way, click my View controller, Update Frames is available, and we can click it and it will move everything to where it should be. So now is a good time to click your device chooser, maybe change the orientation, move something out of the way, update your frames, and make sure it all lines up nicely. So you can run through the whole litany of devices, iPads, iPhones, etc. So we have our year display. I'm just going to change these numbers to whatever it is, whatever the current date might be. So this 1 is a bit misaligned. Now, the reason I've changed the date is to show you that. And if we select all of these items, the Attributes Inspector will show us all the attributes of every single item. And what we actually want to do is center this. So the alignment section, we can click that and change it. So each letter or each number is centered inside of its own label, which looks a lot better. Right, now we need a label to go below that that's simply going to show the date. So control click and drag. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to control, what do we want to do? Well, we want to make this a fixed width, I think. So let's have it as it is, its current width. And let's position it below our 0 label with some vertical spacing. Great. Now let's crank up the font size. Okay, I think that will do. Now, remember how I said that this is the main feature of our app, this year display. So the way we can bring that out is we can click our main label and we can mute its color. So we can have, let's say, a light gray color if we wanted. We can even italicize it. So if we click our font icon, we can give this, oh, we don't have to italicize it, we can make it very thin. Yeah, and I think leave it at that. That looks pretty nice. We can center it if we so wish. So if you look down at the bottom corner of this display, there's a little icon that says Update Frames. And if I click that, it will move everything in place. If I simply click the View controller, Update Frames isn't available, but if I just shift something out of the way, click my View controller, Update Frames is available, and we can click it and it will move everything to where it should be. So now is a good time to click your device chooser, maybe change the orientation, move something out of the way, update your frames, and make sure it all lines up nicely. So you can run through the whole litany of devices, iPads, iPhones, etc. So we have our year display. I'm just going to change these numbers to whatever it is, whatever the current date might be. So this 1 is a bit misaligned. Now, the reason I've changed the date is to show you that. And if we select all of these items, the attributes inspector will show us all the attributes of every single item. And what we actually want to do is center this. So the alignment section, we can click that and change it. So each letter or each number is centered inside of its own label, which looks a lot better. Right, now we need a label to go below that that's simply going to show the date. So control, click and drag. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to control, what do we want to do? Well, we want to make this a fixed width, I think. So let's have it as it is, its current width. And let's position it below our 0 label with some vertical spacing. Great, now let's crank up the font size. Okay, I think that will do. Now, remember how I said that this is the main feature of our app, this year display. So the way we can bring that out is we can click our main label and we can mute its color. So we can have, let's say, a light gray color if we wanted. We can even italicize it. So if we click our font icon, we can give this, or we don't have to italicize it, we can make it very thin. Yeah, and I think leave it at that. That looks pretty nice. We can center it if we so wish. And the last thing we're going to do is actually align this horizontally in the container so it sits where it is. And again, what do? We change the orientation and make sure that is all good to go. So for this device, you might want to move it down a touch or not, completely up to you. We haven't done it yet, but you can restrict a device to only showing portrait or landscape in your app, or both, or a combination of any. We don't need that right now. It's always best to just leave it as it is and make sure it works. So later on, if you want to change your mind about portrait and landscape, you know it's going to work as a layout. Right, so I'm just going to double click this label and say today's date. Our user's not actually going to see that. Our software will update that label before they see today's date. Okay, I think that looks pretty nice, but it's missing something, and that's color. So let's click just the view, make sure we have it selected, and let's give this background an other color. So I don't quite know what we should do here. I think if we chose something like that, whoops, we don't want tint, that's the wrong color. Let's leave that as default. We actually want background. And if you click the background color, so I'll do that again, you'll notice the pink color appears in the list of recently used colors. So we can click that. Okay, now let's select all of our items. In fact, I'm not sure it's going to show very well. So today's date, we might want to change that to a white color and leave 2018 as a dark color, just to give this a little splash of life. Right, so that's almost perfect. We can always come back and change these things, tweak them later. The final task that we have to do is connect this to our storyboards. So open up your assistant editor, or rather connect it to our view controller. I'll make my usual room so we can see what's going on. And here we have our first view controller. Control, click and drag over from our labels. And let's give them a sensible name. So, year, first, letter, label. Or year, first, number, label, that should be. Same with the second one. Year, second number, label. I think you guys can see where this is going. Year, third number, label. And finally, the fourth number. Year, fourth number, label. And I've used a few shortenings of words there, so that's perfectly fine. You can do that as long as you know what's happening in your own app. And finally, our today's date label. days, today, date, label will do nicely. Okay, everything is connected. We're ready to move on to programming in the next section. We are ready to begin coding the first part of our Back to the Future app, where we're going to show the year and the current date to our user. So let's move from this, which currently does nothing, over to a fully functioning app in our Xcode project. It's now time to show the current year via code. So let's open up our first view controller.swift. Now we have an option in here, and that is to do all of our coding in here. But things like getting the current year don't really belong in a view controller, because if you think about it, you might have to use these somewhere else. So what I suggest to you is that you create a new Swift file by right-clicking the project folder, hitting New File, and just create a simple Swift file, which we're going to call Utilities. And I usually create one of these in my projects to hold all the bits and pieces that I don't really know where I want to put them yet. So it's just like a garbage bin, if you like, or a storage system. Garbage bin isn't the correct word for that. So let's create a class called Utilities. Open and close our curly braces. Now, we want to get the current year. So this is going to be a function called getCurrentYear. And this is going to return a string because it's going to be turned into a label. You could return a number. It's completely up to you. Right. Let date equal to. How do we get the date in Swift? Well, that's really simple. You create a new date object. Then it's not as simple as just saying, give me the current date as a string. Weirdly, you have to create a new calendar object, which comes from calendar.current. And this grabs the user's current calendar. So it's localizing this information, if you like. Then we're in a position to actually create our date into a string. And for what it's worth, this is just way, way too complicated compared to something like .NET or C#. This current is not a function. That is a change in Swift. Before it was actually a function, but now it's not. Okay, so now we're ready to create this string year. And how do we do that? Well, first, we grab our calendar, the one we've just created with the lowercase c, and we make a component from it. And what component do we want? Well, we want .year. Now, here's a little Swift action for you. Whenever we are typing something in one of these functions, so I'll just start this function again. I'll type the, whoops, let's remove that. I'll type the bracket again. It says calendar.component as the first argument. It's something that it wants. And then it needs the date that you're creating this from. So if we double click that, it lays these items out for us as calendar.component. And if we hit enter, it makes that muted color come into the foreground. So it's telling us you have to provide me with a calendar component dot, and then one of these, day, era, hour, minute, month, etc., etc. So obviously we just want year. Now, if you noticed before, we could actually just skip out this. We could have .year. And that's because Swift knows the type of, or the class that we're trying to grab things from, and it automatically assumes that comes before the dot. So it's just a shorthand way of writing this. Then, of course, we need the date, and this is the date that we've already created, not with a capital D, a lowercase d. So it corresponds to this one. Okay, so now this needs to be a string. So let's surround everything with brackets, and let's convert it to that string. Finally, we're going to return that back to whatever calls this function. So a bit complicated, just getting a simple date out of iOS, but hey ho, that's what it is. Now that we have our current year, we can't just display it because if you recall in our storyboard, we actually have 4 separate labels. So we need to pull out the character at the appropriate location. So back in our utilities, we need some kind of function to get a letter at a certain index. So get the first, the second, third, or fourth letter at an index. And to do that, we're going to pass in a string, which in our case is just going to be that year that we've grabbed. And we're going to also pass in a location, which is an integer. And so just to make that clear, if we have something like 2018, we're going to pass that in as this string. We're going to pass a location. So we're going to say, if it's location 0, give me this, 1 this, 2 this, and 3 this, because remember, it's 0 indexed. Okay, we are going to return a string from that function. Then, well, how do we get the index out of it? Well, there's a special function that we can use for strings. So we can say let index equal to the string that we've passed in, str, dot index, and it gives us a few options for dot index. So we can have the string index, offset by, etc., etc. So I'm not going to worry about which option it is right now. I'm just going to open a bracket. And I'm going to say string dot start index. So it's going to grab the start index from our string, i.e. position number 0, right at the beginning here. So that's the start. And then we're going to offset that by a little bit, which is offset by, and we're going to feed it this location that we passed in up here. Now, this is all a bit confusing, and if you want to know more, well, I'm not going to labor the point here. I'm just going to let you discover this by yourself. But basically, this is how you get letters at a certain index. Again, Swift makes this just overly complicated. Other languages make it much easier for us. But it is what it is, right? Right. So we are then going to return a string, of course. But from what? Well, we're going to get that original string and we're going to get the index out of it. So all of this complication here is getting an index that Swift understands how to use. So we can't just say get character number 2 or 3 or 4. We actually have to define an index first using this method. Then we have to get the particular substring out of that index. So again, way overly complicated, and I don't know why they do that, but hey. So I'm going to save that. Obviously, there are no .NET developers in their team. That's controversial. Right, let's go back to our first view controller. And let's load up some labels. Now, we want to be sure our label is displayed. So that's going to be guaranteed after the view did load is called. So we can say let year equal to utilities dot get current year. So we now have the year as a string. Then we have to set our label texts. So first we want to do this one. And we can just type shorthand, first num, and it will pick that up for us. You don't have to type year, first of all. You can type the unique part of that variable name, and Swift will go find it for you. So the first label is equal to a new utilities dot and get letter at index. We pass over the year at location 0. Perfect. So let's just copy this. And then let's go for our second year. Second number label. Paste it. Index of 1. Third number label. Paste it. Index of 2. Fourth number label. You get the idea. Index of 3. Right, so this should get everything that we need. Except, I seem to have an issue here. Because I've been silly. It's not the label, it's actually the dot text. Dot text, dot text, etc. So that gets rid of all of our errors. And of course, if we run this in the simulator, we'll get the year displayed. And we're going to do that in just a second. But first of all, there's something that's bugging me here. And that is, look at how many times we've created a new utilities class. 5 times in total. And at the moment, it's not a lot of extra work. But you have to bear in mind that our mobile devices, as good as they are, they're still limited on processor power. And doing things like this, recreating it 5 times, is going to get really tedious and is going to consume unnecessary cycles of the processor. So we can actually fix that. Up in our class level variables section, we can just call one utilities. So let's have utilities. Utils is equal to utilities. I think I've spelt that all right. Utilities, expected declaration of what? Oh dear, Grant. I keep going back to other languages. You'll have to forgive me. It's of type utilities. Silly me. Okay. So we've got our utils. Now down here, we don't have to recreate it. We can remove this and simply say utils. I can copy that and I can just drop it wherever we have utilities. So now we've only created utilities once and we're just simply reusing that to get all the bits and pieces that we need. So that's perfect. Right, we are ready to run this. Let's drop this into our iPhone SE by hitting play in the top left corner. And there we have it. It's showing our current year. Now, if I hit the home button, and actually I hit it twice, and I swipe off that app, and then we load it again, just before I click it, notice that we don't see the template letters that we have there, because they get almost immediately replaced. We see 27 immediately. And if you recall in our storyboard, we had set it to 2018. So that's good. It shows that by using code in view.did.load, that you don't actually see anything yet, but the view is there. Now, just before we go, we have this view.did.load, but there's something else that happens in the life cycle of these view controllers. So we can override some other functions that happen in the background, one of which is called view.did.appear. So this means that code will get executed after the view has appeared. So if you did it in there, there's a chance you would see the 2018 before it flipped over to 2017. Obviously, there's more chance of that, the more CPU intensive your process is for that, so the longer it takes. But also notice all of these different things that appear here. And all of these functions are running by default as part of our UI view controller class that our first view controller inherits from. So there are lots of little lifecycle steps that you can tap into as a developer, and in fact, you need to tap into as a developer in order to insert your own code. So this example we've just done here of view.did.load is to be sure that all of these labels actually exist. If you did this under view will load, you would probably get a crash. Okay, so that's how we sort out the year and displaying it. And I've also shown you a little bit of UI View Controller and all the hidden classes that we can tap into, or rather the functions. Right, let's get on and show a ticking clock in the next lecture. A slightly more difficult lecture, but I think you'll get the idea pretty quickly if you've made it this far. Now we're going to do something a little more exciting. We're going to make our version of a ticking clock so we can show the current date in the month, the day, whatever it is, plus the time ticking every second. So far we have this in our app, just a static year display, but we're going to change this label to that ticking clock. Now, this isn't animation per se, it's something else. It's an event that fires at specific intervals, but it's a good way to lead into animation that we're going to do later on. And it's a nice, cheap and easy way to do it, actually. So let's open up our project and create our ticking clock. So we're going to put our ticking clock into this today's date label. Now, with the clock, we have to get the time out of the system that we're running on. So the best place to do that is not in the view controller code, but it is actually in that utilities Swift file that we created previously. So let's create another function inside of this file. Let's call this func get current time. And this is going to return a string because we're going to output this to a label. And a string is the most convenient way to do that, obviously. Now, we're going to get the date from this. So first, we have to create a new date object. And this is just like we did previously in this get current year section. Let's make a little space here and neaten things up a bit. So we're going to get our date. Now, here's a little thing that bugs me. I've got this line of code and this one in two different places. Now, you might argue it's actually okay to do that because we've got date and that's unlikely to change. But if it does, we still have to change things in two places. So let's create a different function to provide that date instead. Get date, which is going to return a date object. And then all we're going to do is return date, a new version of it. So this may seem like overkill, but in future, if Apple changes this date naming, we only have to change it in one place. So now we can go up here and we can say, well, we can actually remove all of this. And we can return string yada, yada, yada from, and we can just call getDate straight in there. Perfect. Okay, and then in here, we can call letDate equals getDate. Okay, so that's nothing to do with this lecture really, but it's just something that was bugging me. That should be this line of code. We don't want to repeat it. Right, so coming back to our getting current time. Now we're going to display this as a label and it's got to be formatted so a human can read it. So we're going to create a formatter. And this comes from a special class called dateFormatter. And it tells you at the top, a formatter that converts between dates and their textual representations. That sounds like something that we would need. So we'll create that. Now we can specify in our formatter the .date style. So what kind of style do we want? And if I type that again and we read what it says, date style, the date style of the receiver. That's fine. We're going to have .noStyleSet. .none. Sometimes it's no style. I think that's what's been changed between Swift 3 and the current version. And then we're going to formatter.timeStyle is equal to dot medium. Right, so what I've done is we're not going to display the date. I've changed my mind on that. Never mind. We're just going to display the time. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll see what that comes out with. We can always change things around later on. Now, we're going to create a string. So let time string equal to our formatter, and we're going to get a string from the current date. Now, I could pass in this date, or I can call that directly as getDate. So that's just going to pull out from this function. So we've reduced our code a little bit. That's pretty handy. By adding some more lines, ironically, in the end, we've got fewer lines of code to type. So great. Now we just have to return that time string and save that. Now, in our first view controller, let's look for something here. Let's create a function to show time. And then inside of our viewDidLoad, right at the end, we will call it showTime. Okay, so we've got our time. Now, what else do we need? Well, I said we're going to animate this by putting it on some kind of timer. But I think it's better if we start by just simply showing that label. So we can say var time string is equal to, and remember we've got this utils that we created up here. So we can just use that right off the bat. Utils dot get the current time. Then we can show that on our label. So it's actually called today's date label. Today's date label dot text. That's a bit of a misnaming of that, so I might change that later on. Is equal to a time string. Right, so we'll just run that and make sure we get the output that we actually want from it. Oh, we have our usual error. Failed to acquire some kind of lock. That's because it's running. So let's simply remove it. And then replay. Okay, it's running. And there we have our time and date. Now, we could actually put the date in here. So let's experiment with that. Let's go back to our utilities. And let's change our date style to dot. Let's have short. And then just hit play. And let's see what that comes up with. So of course, all of these short, mediums, and whatever are documented on the Apple developer site. So you can go there and look to see what they do if you like, or you can just do it like this. That looks pretty good to me. I kind of like that. Right, so we can stop that. And we can go back to our first view controller. Right, so we're going to create some kind of timer inside of here. And just to show you where you should start if you're a developer and you want to create something and you're not quite sure what to use, just search Apple Developer and then the few keywords that you can think of. And if you did that, you'd come up to this page on Apple's site, using timers. And there's all kinds of information, creating and scheduling. And this is for Objective-C, so this isn't applicable to us at the moment. But Apple gives you ways and methods of doing these things and tells you the gotchas, the things to watch out for, etc. How to stop it, how to remove a timer from memory, loads and loads of things. Now, as a developer, you hardly ever look at this. I'm going to be very honest with you. It's just dry and boring. You'll look at this when you start having problems. That I can promise you. You'll go straight to here and figure it out. But Apple does make this very dry, which is good for me because it means I've got a job teaching you guys. So, this is just a way that you can find out how to do things and what iOS is capable of, or any other operating system for that matter. Then, once you found that out, just simply Google how to run a timer in Swift. So obviously we don't need to Google that because I'm here to show you, but that's just to let you know what you can do as a newbie developer to shortcut your development time. Right. So in our class, we're going to create a var timer equal to a new timer. And this is a timer that fires after a time interval has elapsed, sending a specified message to a target object. And we'll see what that means in a second. Right, so in our view did load, we're going to remove this show time because we're only going to show the time when our timer ticks. We're going to create a new function and we're going to call this timer tick. Okay? Or actually, we're going to call this setup timer. I think that's a better option. Yes. And then we're going to call that in our view did load. Setup timer. Now let's get to the setup timer function itself. Well, we're going to say timer is equal to timer dot, and we can give this a scheduled timer. And inside of those scheduled timers, there are several options for creating it. And what are we going to choose here? Well, there are 3. With time interval on all of them. And does it repeat? And what is the block that we're going to execute when it does repeat? Right, so let's just click enter on that very first one, with time interval. And if you press enter again without moving the mouse or clicking, it will go straight to that time interval variable at the start. So we can remove that, and we want this to tick over every second. Do we want to repeat this? Well, that is a true. And then this block, we can double click that and it fills out everything for us. If we double click the timer, we can just click timer in. And now we can type the code that we actually want to fire. So all we want to do at this point is show the time. So I'm going to save that. And let's see what happens. Well, first of all, we get this error. Call to method show time enclosure, blah, 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 requires explicit self. That's because this little called function inside of here doesn't know what this belongs to, even though to us it's obvious. But to the programming, we have to specifically say self.showTime. So I'm going to save that, and we're going to run that. And I think we're going to get 1 or 2 errors. We might not, and I'll explain why we might or might not after we've had a look at this running. Today's date, and there we have our lovely ticking timer. 6, 8. I think my computer is too slow. So if your computer's too slow, like mine, I have to use a low resolution Mac to record this, which means it's an old one. What you can do is simply change the interval so it actually fires every half second. So you're doubling your processing time, but it's not a lot of processing that's actually happening. And that way you can be ensured that it's going to change pretty much every second. Right, so we've got our timer working and we had no errors, but I did refer to the fact that we might get some errors. Now, I'm not going to cover it here because we can cover these things later on. But if you get an error, it's probably going to be somewhere in this little section with timer. Now, the error that you'll get will be actually related to what's called threading. So if I just open up Google and let's just type threading into Google. That's the wrong thing. We want CPU threading. Here we go. Let me just pull up some images from Google. Now, this is an image for your typical PC. You've got a few threads on each processor. And it's the same in your mobile device. You've got a processor, but you've got different threads that you can process things on. And generally, you can't jump from one thread to a different thread. So, in iOS, everything that happens on the screen happens in the main thread, the display thread, if you like. That's not the real name of it, but I just want to keep things simple here. And over here, your timer, your scheduled timer, might actually start in a different thread. Then, when your timer calls in this little block section, it fires after that half second, it's going to try and run this on the timer's thread. And that's okay if the timer's thread is on the main user interface thread, or the display thread, if you like. So that's fine. But if you try to run this, and especially this line in that block of code, on a different thread, you would get a crash. Now, I'm not sure, because I haven't looked it up, if this always calls back to the main user interface thread. That's something I have to research, or you can research it if you like. But I'm just saying that's something that could actually catch you out. So I'm just going to play this again and check that our half-second interval works. It should do, but my computer is still quite slow. 9, there we go. It skipped one there. Really slow computer. I am running a lot of programs on this in order to record this course. Okay, so that works very nicely. We can stop that running. So that's a nice, simple, cheap way of getting some animation going. And you've also learnt a little bit about threads and being very wary of where your program is actually executing on the threads. Right, so we can move on to the next tab in the next lecture, and we can create some time travel and some actual real animation a few lectures after that. So I look forward to seeing you in that one. We're now going to move on to creating the second tab of our Back to the Future time travel app, which takes care of the actual time travel for us. And of course, the very first step is to lay out all of the design inside of this second tab. Now, it's going to be pretty similar to the first tab, which is going to make our lives a little bit easier. So let's open up our project and get going. The very first step is to go into our main storyboard and select our second view for editing. And you can zoom in using the controls at the bottom of your screen. Let's remove everything that's inside of that view, and let's do a multi-select. Click and drag and make sure nothing else is in there. The other way you can do that is by clicking this view in the list over on the left-hand side, and that will tell you if anything else is in there. Right, so now that it's empty, what we actually want to do is we want to show a year that we are time traveling to. We don't necessarily want to show a date because it's a nice and simple app. So what we're going to do is simply copy over our 4 date labels from the first tab. So we can hit Command-C, select the second view controller, and just press Command-V. And you get a whole bunch of red because nothing is actually aligned just yet. So we can just kind of shuffle this around a bit, perhaps put it in the center. Now let's select the second item and let's constrain this. So we're going to put this horizontally in the center of the container. And then as before, we're going to shift that by roughly, I think it was 32 points. Or it was minus 32 points. Right, so that's roughly in the center. We can check that by going up to our original, double-clicking that constraint. 34 it actually was. So I'm a stickler for getting everything nice and even. Minus 34. Okay, now it is smack bang in the center. We still have a bunch of red. So let's select the second label. And that's because we need to align this vertically in the container. And now everything should be blue, which means we are ready to go. And of course, we can test the orientation of this. So it works in landscape too, as well as portrait. Brilliant. Now let's give this view a background. So simply select the view. Let's go to the attributes and let's choose an other, and perhaps choose a color that looks like it would go well with that pinky type color. You don't have to do this. You can have everything the same color, but it's totally up to you. I think that green looks quite nice. That nice fluorescent green. Right, so we can leave that as is. And here's just a little design lesson. I know this is very basic sort of colors that we're looking at here. But when your user's using your app, there are some familiar elements. There's these 4 labels in the first controller and the 4 labels in the second controller. And when they switch between them, it's the main part of that view controller, which takes their attention to that bit. So it's familiar for a start. And that's good user interface design. Your whole design should feel familiar. Now, I'm not a designer, but I do know a few bits and pieces. And if you've got the money, I'd advise that you actually get an app designer from somewhere like Upwork.com or People Per Hour, any of these freelance sites, and they'll be able to show you things they've done before. And I can guarantee it'll look a lot better than what I've got here. So that's just a pointer for you. Now, our first tab is simply the date, as we know. The second tab is time travel. That implies motion. That implies we are going somewhere and doing something. So I think all of these labels for the year we are traveling to should be made into a slightly different font. So let's see if we can go to the font and click custom. What I'm looking for is perhaps something italic. System italic. It was in front of me the whole time. And with italic, you imply a sense of motion. So I'm just checking what size that needs to be. It needs to be size of 120. So like I was saying, italic implies motion. We're going somewhere. And so you can see that from this. Now we have a slight issue. It's kind of cutting outside of the label. So let's select all these labels again and see if we can fix that. If we scroll down in our little properties section, let's see what we've got here. This clips to bounds means something will not extend past its bounds. And at first I thought that had been switched on for our labels, but clearly it's not. That's something we'll discuss when we come across images again. So it's not that. The only thing we can do here really is lower the size of the font. So let's drop that down until everything fits in its box. Okay, so 105. That fits fine now. And up to you, you can adjust the first one to 105 or not. I think I will, just to keep things consistent. Yeah. Okay, so we've sorted that out. Now, what else do we need? Well, we need a button to actually begin our time travel. And when we click the button, the time travel clock will tick over and do what it needs to do. So before we do that, let's actually just put dashes into this clock, because we don't need it to do anything right now. And because we're going to have a button, I'm actually going to shift this second label up just a touch. So let's select this center for the vertical, and let's have this at -40. Great. Now we can go to our object inspector and go to button, drop one of those in. That button is, of course, going to be centered horizontally. We can double click it and change its title. Time travel, and perhaps we'll call this start time travel. Okay, let's change that color because it doesn't look great at the moment. Text color, we have some options. We could actually choose black. We could have white. I think white looks quite nice in here, a nice contrasty color. Let's change our font as usual. What does 100 look like? Oh, way over the top. 45? No, let's try 35. Okay, so that is our button. All that we have to do is now position that button with a control click relative to the second number. And you can adjust that to your heart's content. So I'll move that a little bit closer. Perfect. So our button's nice and big. We know what we're going to press. So let's save that. And the next step is to outlet all of these items. Now, because this view controller outlets to second view controller, none of these labels are going to have an outlet, even though we actually copied them across. But just to make sure, let's select these labels and select this little outlet inspector at the end. And every single one should have no connections. And of course, the button has no connections. Right, so that's okay. I'll make my little bit of space, open the assistant editor, and let's do the usual jive of control clicking our labels across. So I'm just going to shortcut this and call it first label, second label, third label, and finally fourth label. So those labels are static. We'll leave them as they are. Now we need to control click our button action. Let's have this under view did load. Let's change from outlet to action because we want some code to fire. Time travel button clicked. Perfect. Now we can close that assistant editor. We have all the bits and pieces we need. And we can start to edit the second view controller. So open that. And inside of our time travel button clicked, we actually need some code to execute. So we're going to cover that executable code in the next lecture. Now we're going to cover the code that we need to run in order to display our time travel year, getting a random year. So there's a bit of maths involved in this. And this is going to happen so that we can display this label in the second tab of our app. Now there's one or two things we're going to learn here, especially random numbers, and these are very useful. So let's start. Right, what we have to do is somewhere in our second view controller, well, not just somewhere, we actually want to do this in time travel button clicked method or function. We need to pull out a random year and display that year in each of our 4 year labels. That means we need to get a random year first. So this is kind of something that's not related to the display. So putting it in the second view controller is a bad place to put it. We should put this probably in our utilities.swift. So wherever you like, somewhere in utilities, let's create a new function to get random year. And this is simply going to be a string that is returned. Now, how do we get random numbers in Swift? Well, that's a tricky one. You have to do quite a lot of searching for it, but I'm here to help you out. And what you need is arc4random. And not just random, you need arc4random uniform. And it asks us for an upper bound. So this is going to give us an integer between 0 and whatever bound that we give it. So speaking of time travel, we can't really travel that far in the future because we don't know what it's going to look like, and it's kind of unrealistic. Even though time travel itself is unrealistic, of course, but you know what I mean. It's easier to imagine the year 3000 than the year 6000. So we might want to restrict this time travel just a little bit. Let's restrict this to perhaps 4500. Now we need to return this as a string. And to do that, we use the return keyword, so it fires back this string for us. And that's as simple as it gets. We now have our string. So let's go back to our second view controller, and we can pull out that year from our utilities. Now, in this view controller, we don't have an instance of utilities yet. Remember, we do actually have that in the first view controller. We created it here, but this isn't automatically accessible by the second view controller. So in the second one, we can create an instance of it. Let's have let utils equal to utilities. So now it's available for every function in this class to use. Let's have let year equal to utils.getRandomYear. And that will return exactly what we need. Now all we have to do is assign the text labels of, well, our labels. So first label dot text is equal to what? Well, if you recall, in our first view controller, we did this. We used our utilities and getLetterAtIndex. So going back to our utilities, getLetterAtIndex was this function. That was a bit complicated, but it gets the letter at a certain index in our string. Let's go back to our second view controller, and let's do that. Utils dot get letter@index. Let's give it the year. And if you type your argument into these functions and then you press tab, it takes you to the next item. So it will take you from str to location automatically, and you can just start typing and it will be in position for you. So that's a nice handy little coding shortcut. So let's do second label dot text, and let's practice that handy little shortcut. Utils dot get letter@index, so press enter, then press tab, and the string should be lightly highlighted. Let's give it the year. Whoops, I've done that wrong, haven't I? Okay, you know what? I'm going to hit Command Z and get this right. Get letter@index. So I've pressed enter, I've touched nothing else. Then simply type the string, press tab again. The first tab highlights that year and selects it, and then give it the integer. Right, now time for a speed run. Let's see if I can get this right. Third label, and you can join me in the speed run. Utils.getLetterAtIndex at the year and at integer location 2. And can you see how fast that is? Once you really get going with this stuff, you can talk and you can type like a speed demon at the same time. He says, pausing. It's not that easy, actually. Right, so we have our time travel button clicked. We have our year. Now, let's run this on our iPhone simulator. And hopefully we should have everything that we're after. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to delete this whilst I'm here to make sure we don't get an error again when it tries to load it. Tick tock, tick tock. Come on, there we go. We've got today's date, we're ticking away. Let's go to our time travel, so click the tab at the bottom. Wait for it to peel onto the screen, as mine needs to do, and click Start Time Travel. And we have moved to a year. Now I've just clicked that again, and we've had an error. So you might not get that, but I did get that. What has actually happened here? Now, I was waiting for this to happen because if we click this error, there's a little box next to it. That makes no sense to anyone unless you're a computer, right? So if you get an error, let's bring up this bottom box here. And we get some information in Xcode to tell us what these errors are about. So it's telling us it's something to do with the string, str, and the string contains 417. It's telling us about something, a location. And if I double click that, nothing happens and nothing happens. So that's useless. We've got a self, we've got an index. So what does that all mean? Well, let's go over to this right-hand box and look at the fatal error, can't form a character from an empty string. So that gives me a very big clue. It's trying to return a string at a certain index. But if you look at this little explorer at the bottom, our string, hang on, let's get that down. Our string contains 3 letters. And we've asked for a location 3, which actually corresponds to 4 because we have 0 indexing. So Xcode, or Swift, or iOS rather, has an issue with that because there is no index at place number 4. The string is only 3 characters long. So we've just had our very first crash. So let's fix that. Let's press stop. And it stops running in the sim. Now, what went wrong? Well, let's go back to our folder view. And if your folder view has disappeared, click the uppermost left icon and it will come back. Let's go to our utilities, where we are already. And in get random year, what we would actually like to do is restrict ourselves to only 4-digit years. And the way we can ensure that is actually by adding 1,000. So think about it. If we get 0, we'll actually get 1,000. If we get 200, we'll get 1,200 or 1,200, if you like. So we'll always have a 4-digit. And at the uppermost end, we'll get 5,500. So you could actually increase this to 899 and you'd get 9999. But if you increase this to 9,000, you might get some very strange behavior. It would still work because your string would be 5 digits long if you got 10,000. So our get letter index would still work, but you wouldn't get the 5th letter. So something very weird there. So it would actually work. For now, let's have, 3,500. Now let's save that, Command S, and let's run it again without that error. I hope. Okay, there we have our clock. Let's go over to time travel. Click start, 4326. And keep traveling through time to see that it continuously works. Right, so it does work. Everything is nice and smooth and slick. Right, so you've also experienced your very first crash in an app, and they do happen quite unexpectedly. And as you can see, they happen for reasons that are pretty difficult to ascertain unless you know your program inside out. So just as a warning, as a developer, you will spend a lot of time debugging your apps. Probably 50% of the time at least debugging an app, getting it ready for release. Right, we've covered the code. Now, in the next lecture, exciting bit, we're going to look at proper animations on iOS. You don't want to miss this one. Animations are the lifeblood of your iOS apps, but they are not the feature of your apps. Let me say that again. Animations are not the main feature of your apps. You should repeat that a few times, because when you overdo animations, it completely detracts from what your app should be, which is about the subject you created an app about in the first place. Overdone animations are the fastest way to 1, annoy your users, and 2, take away the focus of your app. And all of that means fewer users, poorer reviews, etc., etc. It doesn't seem like it makes sense if you overdo animations, but that is actually what happens when you over-animate. Right, so an animation, if you look at Apple's guidelines, should serve a purpose, and that purpose is to direct a user or to display sometimes a special event, to encase your event in sort of a special case, if you like. It's very poor terminology, so I'm sorry, but it's to really give a special feeling to a certain event in your app. For example, when we click Start Time Travel and these numbers come up, it's those numbers where we can start to use animations to build up what is happening on screen, to give your user a sense of anticipation. And when you do that, your users get drawn into your app and they become hooked, to put it bluntly. They really, really like seeing that, but only a few % of the time and only for special occasions. And I'll just give you an example before we carry on and create these animations. You've probably played those much older video games where it was, the graphics weren't great, you did what you did, it was all good. But when you reached the end of a level or you had a success in the game, at the end of that level there was an animation. And that's what you lived for as a gamer. For me, I grew up playing the Final Fantasy series. And what I lived for was the full motion video sequences that happened at the end of certain parts of playing through the game. Like, I really looked forward to seeing them. Now, if you played all of those full motion videos from Final Fantasy 8 or 7, for example, which is your favorite? Mine was 8. I know that's going to be controversial for some of you out there. But when you play all of those FMV scenes in a sequence, it's not great. You get bored. And it only holds nostalgic value for me. But when you play through the game, you've worked up an appetite to see something different. So that's what I'm trying to get across here, is that we've used hardly any animations. We have a ticking clock, but that's an animation for functionality. In this case, we're going to reward the user for clicking that button, which will make them click it more often. So that's just animations and what you should be aiming for as a developer when it comes to that subject. So let's look at how to perform the simplest of animations in our project. In your second view controller, which takes care of the time travel part of our app, let's go down to our time travel button clicked function. Now it's in here that we are changing these labels, and that's what we actually want to animate. So let's start with a very simple animation. Just under where we've defined the year, let's access an animation class. And these animations are actually contained in the UI view. So this entire view, if we go to the storyboard here, is actually made of a class called a UI view. And you know that by clicking this class inspector, and you can see it in the top right here. It's a UI view. So we know if we want to do stuff with it, a good first place to look is in the UI view class. And it tells you an object that represents a rectangular area on the screen and manages the content in that area. I think Apple will regret that description when they bring out a circular iPhone or something strange like that. So it can't just be rectangular. You can get lots of different shapes. UI view dot, and just type what you think it might be. And lo and behold, we have an animate. Now we want to give this animation a duration. So how long does it take? That's the very first option, with duration time interval. Then it asks us for an animation bit of code we're going to complete. So we're going to write that. You can alternatively have an animation, and then you can set a bit of code that runs on completion with this version. And if you scroll through them all, you have lots of different options. You can have a delay for it. You can put some options with the animation. There are tons that you can do. For now, we're just going to choose the first option with a duration. So how long is this animation? Let's have half a second. Let's hit tab. And what animations? Well, all we have to do here is open and close our curly braces, remove that grey bit in the middle by hitting backspace, and press enter. So these animations are actually going to be what we're going to do with our labels. So what we're going to do is we're going to slide these items onto screen. right? Sounds simple enough. So let's try that. Let's have first label. Now to slide something, we need to know where it is in space so our animation function can keep up with it and know what's happening and do all of the extrapolation and all the complicated maths for us. So we're going to pass it the center, which is a CG point. This gives it the center of the actual label. We're only doing horizontal, so we want to define dot x, and that corresponds to horizontal. Y is vertical. And what we're going to do to that is we're going to add something to it. Plus equals. What are we going to add? Well, we're going to add the view dot bounds dot width. So that adds the whole width of the view to our first label. Now, it's got some errors about reference to property. That's because it wants self. So just click fix and it will say I need to put self in order to know where this is. And that's a common mistake that people make, and it'll be the same in self.view. Okay, so we're all sorted there. I'm going to save that, and we're just going to run that and see what actually happens there. And there's quite a lot to talk about and take apart in this lecture, and I'll get to that in due course, because you've probably got a few questions as to what you've seen there. For example, why do we have the text after the animation? Well, I'll tell you something secret in a bit. So let's go to our time travel. Let's click start. And there's our 1. 3, 1, 2, 1. Okay, so that works very nicely. Now, what's going on here? Because this label gets set, and this one, etc. And in this block of code, it runs through. So it executes this, then it executes this, but it doesn't wait to execute this. It just moves straight on and executes this. So this block here is running what we call asynchronously. It's not running line by line and waiting for each line to finish. That's important to know. Very, very important to know, because asynchronous programming techniques are everywhere these days, and they help us create really responsive apps. So that's your first introduction to async programming. And if you're a previous .NET developer, you'll know exactly what that's about. Right, let's do the same for our other 4 labels. So just copy and paste. Let's have a second label, a third one, of course, and the final one. Okay, so now we can run that. And whenever you click play on the simulator, it automatically does save your project. Now it's going to animate all those at the same time. Let's go to our time travel. There it is. So the whole thing slides on screen, seemingly at the same time. Brilliant. So that's quite good, but I would actually like to make this a bit better. So let's press stop. And how are we going to make this better? Well, this function, first of all, is getting a bit complicated. So let's take this animation stuff out and create a separate function called animate item. Let's open brackets. We have to pass in some items. First of all, a duration in time, which is a double. And what I would like to do is bring one label on, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next. And in order to do that, we need a delay between our animations. So we're going to pass in a delay for that, which will be a double. And then we have to actually pass in the item that we want to animate. So we can say this is just the object, and this is of type UI view. And you might be saying, but Grant, this isn't a UI view, this is a label. But labels inherit all the way back from UI view. Everything on screen comes from a UI view. So everything on screen can use the properties of a UI view. If you're still confused about inheritance, go back to the Swift section that I've done, and that will tell you what inheritance is all about. Right. Then we also have to pass in a location from, and this is a special type. It's called CG float. Then we have to pass in a location to, called CG float, or type of CG float. And this tells us the basic type for floating point scalar values in core graphics and related frameworks. Don't worry about that for now. Just know, generally speaking, you pass in a CG float for a location. It's just 2 points, x and y. Where is the thing? Right, so that's our function created. Now let's create our actual animation. So just like we did before, UIView.animate. Now we want very specific ones. We want this one, I think, with duration, delay, options, and completion handler. So that is exactly what we want. Now with duration, we are going to pass in, obviously, the duration in our function, the delay, delay. We're going to pass in some options. Now we can actually create these options, or we can use some of the built-in ones. So just have UI view animation options there. Press dot, and let's have curve, ease in and out, or actually curve, ease out. So it'll slow down as it gets to its final point. And then our animations, we can hit enter, and we can actually animate our items. And what are we going to animate? Well, we're going to animate the object dot center dot x plus equals, just like we did before, self dot view dot bounds dot width. So that's simple enough. And on completion, we can do something else if we so wish. And if you just double click this and put in a Boolean, so true, it has completed, then you can have some optional code to complete at end of animation. So that's totally up to you. You can actually add that. Great. And I don't think we actually need from and to in this. It's just cluttering up our view. I think that's from a previous tutorial that I did where I added in some extra options. We don't worry about that for now because we have our from and to with the object we pass in and the view that we are actually sitting in. Right, so now we can scroll back up and we can remove this entire section here. And we can replace it with animate item. We can give it the duration of ½ a second, hit tab. We can start the first letter immediately, and let's pass over the first letter, the first label, and that will do what it needs to do. Then we can just simply copy this and paste it underneath 3 times. So we can change to the second label for this one, the third label, and the fourth label. Right, now we want them to we want the animation duration to be the same. 0.5 for each one is fine. We want to delay each one by just a little bit. So let's delay this one by 0.2 seconds, this one by 0.4, this one by 0.6. So can you see what's happening here? We're firing off this animation. It's coming into here. It's saying, I'm going to animate this item, this object, first label, and I'm also going to apply a delay. I'm going to wait a little bit. But the beauty of this is that it's asynchronous. So this executes immediately. It doesn't wait for this bit to happen. Same with the second, third, and of course the fourth. And because of that, it doesn't matter that these get assigned at the end. To our human eyes, we can't notice the speed, the difference between them. And in fact, all of this probably happens in the tick of one processor cycle, which isn't technically true, so don't crucify me in the questions on that. But you know what I mean. It happens so fast, we just don't know it. Right, let's run that. And hopefully, this is going to give us a little delay, just a noticeable one, on each item. So we have today's date. Let's go time traveling and start. And there it is. So it unfurls from that side. Shup, chup, chup, chup. And I think that actually looks pretty neat. I really do like that animation. Right. So that's how you create very simple animations. And it's also an introduction to asynchronous methods executing inside of your code. Well done for sticking it out in this lecture. It was actually a pretty tough one, and there's a lot of stuff to take away and learn from this. So if you want to have a break before we go on to the next one, and I set you a bit of much easier, I promise, homework, then feel free to do so. It's much better that these things sink in very slowly so you can understand them. Like I say, asynchronous programming, that is your God from now on when it comes to programming. You're going to use that so many times. And if you understand it now, your development career is just going to take off. It'll be so good. Right, go have a break and I'll see you in the next one. Here we go, a little bit of homework for you. And you're probably saying, oh, what now? What do I have to do? Well, sorry, but I'm fussy. When I make apps, they have to be just right. They have to be free from errors and little distractions, because distractions really spoil the flavor of your app. So in our time travel app, our little clock tick shows today's date as a label before it ticks over once. So what I want you to do is fix that. As soon as our app loads, I want it to be showing the time immediately, so we don't have that little distraction. The second task and final task for your homework is something I wouldn't necessarily do in this app, but I want you to do it to practice your animation capabilities. I want you to make the background screen of tab 1, so this time now, change color every time that clock ticks. And it can be to any colors that you like, absolutely up to you. Now, in order to animate that, you're going to change the background view color, but I would also like the color to fade out and fade back in. Fade out, fade back in. So it's smooth and not jerky. In order to do that, you will have to use something called the alpha property of your background view. So this is your chance, and I hope you're writing this down because there's a lot I've just said there. This is your chance to really go and explore the things that you can animate using stuff like UI view animate. So there's a couple of 1 or 2 bits and pieces that are fairly new, but you should understand by now where to go look for these things or to use the code autocomplete in Xcode to see what's going on. Right, so I'll leave you to that, and I'll see you in about half an hour once you've attempted it, when I will give you what my solution is. Good luck. Last time, I gave you a few tasks I would like you to attempt in our Back to the Future app. And we'll just recap. I bet you groaned when I said more homework, and you went, oh, what now? Well, I'm fussy. So I would like you to remove this clock tick delay at startup. I don't want to see that label text. It's up to you how you did it, of course. And then also I wanted you to make the background screen of tab 1 change color, but also fade in and out with a nice animation using the alpha property. So let's have a look at how I would go about solving this problem and compare and contrast to yours. Let's first tackle the easiest part of this homework, the today's date. What you could do is just double click this and you could hit space or something so it doesn't exist. That's totally up to you. I'm not going to do it that way. That's the lazy man's way. What we're going to do is open up our first view controller, and we're going to look at, what have we got here? We have our setup timer, self.showTime. Here we have show time, and this changes our label to show the time, of course. So all we have to do is go up to view did load, so we know our view is there, and somewhere in here, it doesn't really matter where, we can simply call show time. That completely solves the problem. So now if we hit play, you can guess what the result will actually be. Should it ever load. It's like running the latest iOS on a really old iPhone, this. And there we have our time display. No delay whatsoever, apart from skipping 2 seconds in my case. Okay, so that solves that one. Really simple. Now the animation problem. Right. What are we going to do? Well, first of all, let's set up some kind of function. It's always a good starting step. Let's have animate background. I think that will do nicely. Now we go back to our familiar UI view dot animate. And of course, we give this a time interval. We could give this a second. We could actually give it a bit less. Let's say 0.3 seconds. A delay of 0. We can give it some options. So this can be, if you just hit enter, it auto-fills that for you. Let's have dot, curve. We can have ease in and out if we wish. Whatever you want. Experiment with everything. Nothing is wrong here. Hit tab on those 2 brackets to void. Hit enter, and now you can enter your code in here. So what code are we going to enter? Well, let's have self.view. And remember, I said we can set alpha. We can set this of the background, or we can do it of the view. So if I just show you that, background color dot with alpha component, but that's a bit more complicated. Let's just have view dot alpha. And what are we going to do? We're going to set that to 0.5. Alpha goes from 0, where you can't see it, to 1, where it is opaque. So 0.5 is halfway. And actually, let's make this duration 1 second. So it goes over the whole tick. 1 second. And on completion, just double click that, double click bool, and you can put true, so it has completed successfully. On completion, we have to reset our alpha because this doesn't change itself back. So self.view.alpha is equal to the original, which is 1.0. Right, so that is pretty simple. Now, where do we run animate background? Well, we want to run this when our clock ticks. So let's go down to... We could run this in show time, but that's kind of a bad place to put it because we call show time now in view did load, and we don't want to run it there. We actually want to run this every time our clock ticks. So it's probably best to run it in setup timer. And now we have a conflict. This runs every half second, which means this UI view animation is going to run, essentially, it's going to run twice over itself for every 2 ticks of the timer. So we'd better change this timer to 1.0, I think, to make sure those 2 animations and the timer actually overlap. So they perfectly are in sync with each other. Now, self.showtime, we can just below that hit self.animate background. So that's going to start changing the alpha. So when I hit play, it'll set up the timer and animate background every time. And I apologize for my poor performance on this simulator. I actually think it's not my computer. I think it's just this beta version of iOS 11 that's running this. So there we go. We're running up and down. You can make this more subtle if you like to change the old alphas. You can drop the alpha to whatever you please, really. So let's just drop it to 0.8. Make it subtle. Right, so in the last section, I set you a little task, which was also to change the color if you so wished. Now, a color is more a utility. It's nothing to do with a view unless you apply the color. So I think we should put this in utilities. And let's have a function called getRandomColor. And what is this going to return? Well, that's a good question. How do we know what to return if we're a new developer? Well, let's go to our first view controller. And let's, for example, just anywhere, let's try self.view.backgroundColor. And look, it says UI color. That's how we know what we want to return. So we can go to utilities again, and we can return a UI color. And you may say, why isn't it showing up? Because utilities, it says use of undeclared type. Doesn't know what it is. Stupid Swift. That's because we need to import the user interface kit class. And once we've done that, it will know what UI color is all about. There we go. Now we have to get a random color. So let's try it. Let color Coors Light, I could do with a beer right now, it's pretty warm where I am, is equal to UI color dot. Now what have we got? Well, we've got fixed colors. That's okay. Get red, get something. We can get some of these inits. Recall init is called when we first call a color. We have lots of things. Right, so what we're going to do, instead of getting the default colors, we're going to delete this point and we're going to create our own color. So if you open the brackets, it gives you the options that we just saw as all the inits. So we have lots of options: hue, saturation, brightness, alpha. And if you are a graphical design guy, you'll know what all of this stuff means. It's just ways of defining colors and alphas and whatnot. So we could try some of this. We define red, green, blue, and alpha. I think that sounds pretty reasonable. Now, I always forget how much it wants. Does this red lie between 0 and 1? Or does it lie between 0 and 255? I say 255 because that is one of the standard ways of defining how much red, green, or blue there is. Well, let's find out. Let's experiment. Let's try 0.5, 0.5. Let's remove that. And let's have our blue at 1.0. So this will be more blue. And of course, alpha, we want this to be completely just alpha. And now we can return this color. So we haven't made it random yet, but we're just doing an experiment here. Let's go to our first view controller. Let's go to animate background. And let's set the background color. Self.view.background color is equal to our utils dot get random color. I know it's not random, that's fine. So it should display blue the first time it ticks. So I'm going to run this. And if it does, we know we're on to a winner. And all we have to do then is get some random numbers going. Tick. Brilliant. So it is between 0 and 1. And you can see that very subtle animation there. Apart from the peeling at the top, that's not part of it. So let's stop that. Go back to our utilities. We know this should lie between 0 and 1. Right, so now before this, we need to get a random number between 0 and 1 to give us a random color. So let's create another function. Get rand between 0, 1. It's quite a long thing that, but hey ho, it is what it is. Now what do we want to return? Well, if we look at this UI color, and again, if we just start typing UI color, open a bracket, it will tell us that it needs a CG float, which is just essentially a float. Oops, something's gone weird there. Go away. So we're going to return from here a CG float. So it's like a float, but it has some core graphics implications which are related to all of the animations and stuff happening on our screen. Now, let's get our arc4random. It's such a random name, I just don't understand it. Anyway, let's give this an upper bound. Now we're going to divide this, whatever number we get, by the relevant number so we can get a float between 0 and 1. And the problem with arc4random is it returns an integer, a whole number, and we obviously can't use that. So let's think about this carefully. Let's return a number between 0 and 100. Then let's divide the answer by 100. So you'll get 0 to 1 in the end. Okay. Now that in and of itself will probably give us a double. So if I just get rid of those brackets, if I try to return this, let's see what Swift says once it's processed what I've done here. Cannot convert expression of type uint32 to return type CG float. Replace arc4random blah de blah with CG float of that. Perfect. So what Swift is doing is it's converting this answer to a CG float. And hopefully that's going to have the effect that we need. Now all we have to do is come up to getRandomColor and use that function. GetRand between 0 and 1. And all we have to do is copy that to the other sections. So let's replace these point whatevers and the blue. Then save that and let's run it. And hopefully now we're going to get random numbers. Now this random stuff it's not as random as the name implies. Haha, bad joke. It's something you're going to use pretty often in your programming career, random numbers. Aha, so we have an error. We just have a black screen. And that is no good for us. So we've got a bit of debugging to do here. Why do we get a black screen? Well, let's go to our rand between 0 and 1. Let's create a let rand number equals to this. Let's print that to our console so we can see as developers what's going on. And then let's return it just like we had before. So now when we hit play, we can actually see what number is being generated. So we understand what range is being produced. And we can see where we've actually gone wrong. Or rather, I have gone wrong. Let's be honest about this. This is my problem. We just have a whole bunch of zeros. That's no good. So let's stop that. Right, so we've got this arc4random. And what I think we need to do is we might actually have to cast this result to a double. So open and close the brackets. We can always try. There's no harm in trying sometimes. Well, there is in programming, but hey. And let's have 100.0 to make sure it is a double. Now let's hit play. There we go. So you see, it was actually a problem. Never mind the peeling of my screen there. It was actually a problem of, and if we stop that, we can see it was a problem of converting this to a double, because before we were dividing an integer by an integer and it was giving us strange results. Remember, we did that quite a while back in this course, or these courses, however you're seeing this, and we discovered that dividing integers can actually give us very unexpected results. So that's the number one place you need to look if your maths is going wrong. Right, that is our Back to the Future app complete. It's not the best looking app in the world, but it is functional. So, well done for completing this. And there's just one more lecture to go to, and that is the summary of everything you've learned. Right, guys, what a module. Well done for completing it. That was a pretty tough one, and it's a pretty long one, so you deserve a nice break in the sunshine now, if you've got some sunshine where you are. You've learned so much this time around, so let's just have a very small recap. you learned about tab bars, tab bar controllers, how to put icons into those tab bars, and generally how that system works in storyboards. You also learned how to construct layouts with relative positioning to other items on the screen, and you've also learned a few best practices. I hesitate to say best because perhaps my ways aren't the best, but they definitely work well for me and have served me well over the years. So you've learned some practices, some grant practices, so you can actually achieve that. What else have you learned? You've learned how to create a utilities class, get random strings, get letters from the strings. You learned about your first errors in getting those letters in terms of getting them from a certain location. You learned how to set up timers that run actually asynchronously. So they run after some code, after the... sorry, I'm tongue-tying my words here. Shut up, Grant. Sort it out. Okay. Timers are asynchronous, so they will run in the background and they won't block your main UI code. There we go. That's what I meant to say. I've been teaching for too long today. I really think I need a break. What else have you learned? Well, finally, you learned how to animate elements on screen. You learned the very basics of UIView.animate. That's going to come in very, very handy when you create apps, as long as you don't overdo it, of course. Right? All that's left is to give you your reward of fireworks.